Hey Claire, it's great to see you. I really like getting a chance to get together and talk about these things in between the monthly webinars.
Yeah, absolutely. As always, we have so many questions come in on our live webinar, but especially in the past few months with everything that's going on with Ukraine and Russia's invasion, there have been so many important questions that we haven't had time to address. So it's great that we have the opportunity to do so. So as we've been doing, Dan and I have selected a few questions that we did not get to on this month's webinar, and we will provide some additional answers and context. So with that, Dan, our first audience question is, will compromise signal a win for Putin?
Well, it's a terrific question. And it's interesting, Claire, because when we did the webinar at the beginning of April, I think I may have given a different answer then, because the war has changed so dramatically just over the last couple of weeks. At this point, a compromise, and the one which gets speculated about the most, would be Russian troops, Russian control remaining over some portion of the eastern Donbass region of the Ukraine. That would allow Putin to claim victory. The Ukrainians, of course, are fighting back very fiercely against that, both militarily, of course, but also diplomatically. And their negotiators have floated the idea of a couple of other different kinds of compromise, not any territorial concessions, but rather Ukraine declaring its neutrality, the way Finland and Sweden have in the past, for example, and pledging not to join NATO for a particular period of time. The challenge that Zelensky faces at this point is he has done such an effective job of mobilizing public support among his own people for his own efforts to lead the defense against Russia's invasion. Remember that Zelensky was at 30% in Ukrainian public opinion polls when the war started, and that, of course, has now skyrocketed. He's done such a good job of marshaling public support that if he were to announce that he were allowing Russia to maintain some control, even a control over a very small part of the eastern region of the country, he might face some internal political backlash. So Putin, if he is able to keep some territory, can claim victory. If he has to leave Ukraine completely, if Russia has to leave Ukraine completely, and Ukraine does agree not to join NATO for a period of time and declares its neutrality, Putin will, of course, still claim victory, but it might be a little bit less plausible for the audiences he's trying to reach. So I guess ultimately where we wind up is almost every end of war negotiation, except for abject surrender, does end in some type of compromise. We still have to see what that compromise is going to look like. And given the way that both Putin and Zelensky are talking in public now, it doesn't appear that's going to happen for quite a while.
Great, thank you, Dan. Our next question from the audience is, why have cyber attacks appeared to be so low at the moment?
Well, this is one of the great mysteries of the first weeks of the war. And it's worth noting that at least the time that we're recording this, Claire, the war is only about 6 weeks old. And in the annals of warfare, it's actually a very short period of time, and speculation is growing that this is something that could last for many months, perhaps even years, before it's resolved. But before the Russian invasion, one of the greatest concerns that many Western observers had is that in addition to conventional warfare, and in addition to the very, very horrific prospects of chemical warfare, which has now been rumored, and of course limited nuclear warfare, there's been some thought that Russia might end up being very, very aggressive on the cyber front, disrupting necessary functions of government, not just in Ukraine, but throughout Europe and in the United States. And while there have been some disruptive efforts in Ukraine from Russian allied cyber experts, there's been relatively little in Europe and almost none, at least to date, in the United States. And no one really knows why, but it's been reported in just a couple of places now that in fact, the US Cyber Command has done a very, very aggressive, and at least to date, effective job of disabling a lot of Russia's online warfare capabilities, and that they've been disabling the type of cyber war armaments, if you will, that Russia would be using against the US. Now, there's no way to know if this is true or not. It's entirely possible that we're just lucky, and in the weeks ahead, that could change. But at least there's some speculation from credible sources that the US cyber defense has actually been extremely effective in disabling the type of online warfare that might have been much more disruptive to our society here in the US.
Thank you, Dan. So our final question for this segment kind of alludes to what we'll be talking about on next month's webinar. So make sure that everyone register for that program. This person asked, do you think an invasion of Taiwan would create the same kind of Western unity as the Russian aggression in Ukraine?
I feel, Claire, like my answer to all of our questions today is a very expanded version of I don't know. So I might as well keep that streak going, because the honest answer is we don't know how this war is going to affect China's plans for Taiwan. There's two competing theories. Here. One is that China, believing that the US and West are so distracted by a war in Eastern Europe, will see this as an ideal opportunity to move more aggressively against Taiwan, thinking that the US and its allies have neither the military capability nor the attention to focus on two outbreaks of violence at the same time, half a world away from each other. And it's worth noting that while this war has been waged in Ukraine, Iran and North Korea and other bad actors around the world have taken advantage of the United States and our allies' focus on Ukraine to step up their own activities in a variety of ways. So that's one theory. But on the flip side is an argument, which I do think is a very plausible one, which suggests that just like Putin underestimated the Ukrainian resolve, and more relevant to this conversation, Western unity, Putin simply did not believe that Biden would be able to marshal NATO to be such a unified force for an ongoing period of time. And China's been watching this very carefully. And it's entirely possible, perhaps even likely, that the Chinese leadership is saying, boy, if the West really can get its act together and come together to confront Russian aggression in Ukraine much more effectively than we had thought would be possible, maybe we don't want to run up against the same type of unified Western response if we were to move aggressively against Taiwan. China's in a very difficult position with Russia. Just before the war, of course, they committed to much greater and expanded military and diplomatic cooperation between the two countries. China has somewhat stayed neutral in this, but is helping Russia in a number of different ways. And they're realizing that this kind of economic disruption, this kind of interference with their trade in Europe in particular, but in Latin America and elsewhere too, is just not what they need. So just like Putin expected a very fast and clean war, so did China. And now that the war is getting more complicated and more extended, I don't think the Chinese leadership likes where it is. But whether that increases or decreases the likelihood of them moving on Taiwan, once again, simply don't have an answer, at least not today.
Great. Well, like I said, we'll be coming back to this topic on China and Taiwan in next month's webinar. We'll also be discussing how what's happening in Ukraine is going to and already is impacting U.S. domestic politics. So you can go to our website now and register for next month's program. Dan, thank you so much for continuing the conversation on all of the headlines and current events for this month. We are so appreciative for your expertise and guidance in such challenging times.
Well, as usual, you are very nice, Claire. It's always great to talk to you. And I'm really glad that we can continue these conversations in between the webinars. And like you, I'm looking forward to seeing our group reassemble again in just a couple weeks.
Sounds good. All right, Dan, have a good week.
You too. See you soon, Claire. Good day, everybody.